Hello, I'm Ann Petrick, Vice President of Research at Vistage, and thrilled to be here hosting the latest webinar in our Peak Performer webinar series. This series is designed to support your leadership climb by bringing the most trusted experts to the Vistage community, those who provide exceptional insight and best practices to help you navigate new challenges and opportunities. Now, our Vistage members have the opportunity to hear from a variety of experts that come to their groups. Our annual Speaker Awards program recognizes the top speakers, and I'm pleased to share that today we have the Vistage Speaker of the Year, Robert Cujo Teschner. His topic, accountability, is a hot one as leaders have learned to adjust to hybrid and remote environments, as well as the challenges of hiring. Cujo will share with us what accountability does right looks like, and based on how high performing teams address this important practice. Cujo is a successful entrepreneur, a multiple award-winning speaker and writer, and a sought-after consultant. But there are three things that you should know about Cujo. Number one, he is an entrepreneur first and foremost, who deeply appreciates the role that small businesses play in our economy. So more on this in a bit. Number two, as the current Vistage Speaker of the Year, he's expanding a team of fighter pilot instructors to teach throughout Vistage in government and in industry to help organizations win by building teams that harness high performance principles. He'll teach us some of those principles today. And finally, fun fact, Cujo is a classically trained violin and piano player who also loves the bass guitar. He's authored or co-authored three national best-selling books, and he's working hard now so he can teach his children to fly what will eventually be the family P-51 Mustang. Cujo has spoken to more than 420 Vistage groups, and I'm thrilled to welcome him today to share his perspectives to even more leaders in our community. Please join me in welcoming Cujo. Over to you.
Hey, thank you very much, Ann. Thank you, Vistage, for the opportunity to be able to present today. You know that I'm a big fan of who you are, what you do, and I'm a huge fan of everybody that's tuned in. I know we're busy. I know it's a Friday. I know that there's a lot of things that we could be doing, but the fact that you're choosing to spend a little bit of time digging into de-weaponizing accountability to try to up the leadership game, I think that's admirable, commendable, and I salute you. What I'd like to do is spend the next couple of days talking about a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, but I understand that we're limited by, practicalities and whatnot. What do we have, an hour scheduled for this? So I'll honor that. I will stick within the time constraints of today, and we're going to center our conversation around the practice of accountability. And I promise you this, everywhere I go, I ask people, how satisfied are you with the degree of accountability practiced by your teammates? In fact, I ask people to raise their hands if they are satisfied with the degree of accountability that's manifested or practiced by their teammates. And it is the exception when a group of people has somebody, one person that raises their hand. In fact, yesterday I was in Omaha, Nebraska, and twice in a row we got zero hands that were raised. And I think even when we raise our hands and say, yeah, I'm satisfied, there's always a little bit of a caveat, like, I think some of the people get it, maybe not everybody does. How do I answer this? I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. And I don't think that that's a sustainable way forward. I also think that it reflects directly on how it is that we're leading. In fact, I know that it reflects directly on how it is that we're leading, because accountability and leadership are synonymous. So with that as sort of the kind of the teeing off point here, what I'd offer you is that I had what I'd say semi-uncomfortable introduction into accountability. A number of years ago, back in 2004, I was told that I was going to teach accountability at the U.S. Air Force Weapons Instructor course. I was going to be the person responsible for making sure that our top practitioners were really dialed in on how to practice team and then team of teams level accountability. And I say that this was an uncomfortable thing for me because I didn't think that the topic was very sexy. And of all the different things that I could teach at the Weapons Instructor course, also formerly known as the Fighter Weapons School, this was not probably the sexiest topic. And yet I really didn't have a choice in the matter. And so I was just dumped into a process that I had to embrace because it was my responsibility to teach. And one of the neat things about teaching it is that I became really well versed in it, to the point where I became a huge champion of it, to the point where I realized this is probably the best thing that I've ever been asked to do professionally. And it's given me so much insight into how human beings perform. It's given me tremendous insight into how it is that we team. It's given me personally tremendous insight into how it is that we lead. And so I'm grateful for that experience back in 2004. What you see in the background of the slide are a couple of the papers that I had a role in developing. One sort of came up with a standard lexicon or vocabulary for how it is that we practice accountability in the United States Air Force. The other one was sort of the, dare I say, Bible of how to practice accountability in the tactical version of the United States Air Force. So that's how I became really interested in this topic, out of necessity, because I was asked to do it. Now we take that and we take the notion that accountability is leadership, and we apply it to where we are in today's world. And it's a very challenging place for us as business leaders to lead, isn't it? Couple of months ago, Gallup released the State of the Global Workplace, their 2023 report. Outstanding document. And what they basically said was that employee engagement is improving. I've decided of my own volition to kind of translate that for us into employee engagement is just, it's just not good. And I say that because the numbers substantiate that it's not good. Only 23%, according to Gallup, of workers across the globe are thriving, fully engaged in the work that they do right now. So what are the rest of the employees across the globe doing? Well, 59% of them are quiet quitting, a term that we're familiar with, doing the minimum, watching the clock, waiting until they can leave. But if you add these two numbers together, and I'm not good at math in public, you find that this is still shy of 100%. So what are the rest of the people out there doing? And it turns out that they're doing this new thing called loud quitting. And maybe it's not a new thing, but it's a term that I had not heard of until I read the State of the Global Workplace report. And loud quitting is defined as taking actions to harm the organization. And you just look at these numbers and you realize that almost as many people as are thriving are loud quitting, taking actions to harm the organization. Now, why in the heck is that happening? And if you've seen me in a workshop, if you've heard me on a keynote stage, you know that I firmly believe it's leadership. And there's so many things that we can say. We can say, oh, it's the current generation. They just don't understand. It's folks that just don't get it. They're not bought in. But you have to ask yourself, really, is it a generational thing? And if our employees aren't bought in, whose fault is that? Ultimately, whose responsibility is it to draw people in, to get them fired up and excited about whatever it is that we do, to a point where they're passionate about doing it, so passionate that they look forward to coming back, regardless of what industry, regardless of what their position is, regardless of how insignificant some of us think that what it is we do is. That's a leadership function, friends. And I do have to kind of ask us all to ask ourselves on the inside, like, how equipped are we to lead? I mean, how many of us that are tuned into this webinar today were actually formally trained to lead? And realize that baked into this idea of being trained to lead means also being taught how to properly practice accountability, because leadership and accountability, they're essentially synonymous. Like, leadership absent accountability is toxic. And I think one of the problems that we have as business leaders, as entrepreneurs, is that oftentimes we were the idea person, came up with a great, brilliant idea. We took the idea to market. People started buying it. All of a sudden, boom, we're leading the team. It used to be just one of us. And then the team starts to expand. We got more people that are joining. And we're realizing this is a complex enterprise, but we're still the idea person. We kickstarted this whole thing. So we're sort of the default leader. Is it enough just to have had the idea? And if we haven't been trained, what's the expectation that we're going to do it well? And I think maybe we can all confess to ourselves here in the privacy of this webinar, where most of us aren't on camera or are talking, that potentially we may not have everything that's demanded of us right now to lead well in the now. And so what do we rely on in the absence of formal techniques and procedures? We come up with Band-Aid solutions. And there are a number of Band-Aid solutions. Here it is, we're leading the team. We're trying to figure out how to address a performance deficiency. And we realize that maybe there's a teammate or two that aren't quite pulling their weight. So what do? We pull them aside and we have a one-off conversation. In fact, many of us have actually been taught that accountability needs to be performed in private in those one-off conversations, because that's just the best way to punish, right? Punish in private. Good. What I would offer you is that performance is a team issue, and real learning has to happen together because everybody has an input on the outcome. And so private accountability does not serve us. And I think it's a bad Band-Aid, but there's a worse Band-Aid. And it's this one. And I see this throughout organizations across North America, Canada, US, probably across the globe. We come to the end of an event, the end of a project, the end of something, and we ask ourselves potentially as a team, all right, team, what went well and what didn't? And we feel good because we've asked some questions, we've gotten some feedback, we've taken some notes. The problem is that these questions, they're insufficient. And why? Number one, they're the wrong questions. Number two, they're grossly incomplete and inadequate as a methodology. Okay, so we've got that. And then we've also got this one. This potentially no, there's no doubt, this is the worst by far. We just avoid accountability. We justify it by saying, hey, if I hold somebody to account, they might walk. Some performance is better than no performance. Hopefully they'll figure it out on their own. And I think everybody here would recognize this as weak leadership, entirely inadequate. That's not a Band-Aid solution. That's actually running from the problem. And right now we have to overlay on top of all of this the fact that it's an incredibly difficult time to lead. COVID cases are rising again. The pandemic had a devastating impact across the globe. One of the devastating impacts of COVID-19 in North America is that it's managed to expose, deepen, and widen existing fractures within our society to such a degree that I think most of us would agree that we're on two sides of an epic divide right now. And it's gotten to the point where the battle lines are drawn. If you're not with me, you're against me. And there's very, very low empathy, inclination to try to understand why somebody else thinks the way that they do. And that just gets further inflamed with politics. You add to it a number of nasty factors like skyrocketing costs, and what Gallup's CEO John Clifton wrote about last year in his outstanding book Blind Spot, the fact that nonstop negativity with an absence of accountability leads to a global rise of unhappiness. It's a tough time to be called to lead literally anything. And if we're not equipped to do so, then it's going to be a really, really challenging experience for us, and very, very highly stressful experience. And what we're up against is this rise of the victim mentality. It ain't my fault. I'm 100% defensive. You're going to hold me to account for something, I'm going to tell you it's Anne's fault that this didn't go down. She didn't put the cover sheet on the TPS report. How could I do my part? Right? It's finger pointing. It's trying to blame somebody else. That's not a healthy place for us to be. Maybe we take a moment to assess individually, what's it costing us to allow this victim mentality to fester? How is that affecting the health of my organization? And just take a pause. If you have something to write with, maybe you jot a note down. I think this is important, because allowing this to fester, yeah, that's a leadership problem. Good. Many of you who are tuned in today sell outstanding products and services. And potentially many of us here today have relied on the quality of product to kind of keep the team together. But friends, leadership is what creates a winning team, not the product or the service. And if we can get to real leadership, we now become differentiated from our competition, which is increasingly playing for average. Like, we're increasingly seeing companies that are playing for average or worse. So if we can up the leadership game, we're onto something very, very special. And there's a cost factor that we have to be aware of. When we lose people due to any number of factors, to include inadequate leadership, it costs us a lot to try to replace them, according to Gallup. You're looking at a big fan of Gallup over here. 1/2 to 2 times the employee's annual salary is what it's costing conservatively to replace somebody that we lose. So that's something that none of us have budget for, I would think. So where do we go with this? One of the things that we're here to talk about today is to recognize that accountability is what I would refer to as the nuclear core of teamwork done correctly. It has to be practiced evenly in order for the team to work. And as soon as we have an uneven distribution of accountability, the entire team dynamic starts to fall apart. And what I've heard from many of you, all right, and I know that there are friends of mine in the audience today, you've told me as leaders that you're tolerating poor performance, poor behaviors from certain people because having somebody in the seat is better than not having anybody, you say. And so almost by default, you're allowing somebody to be held to a different standard from the rest of the team. And when you do that, when we as leaders do that, we're creating an unjust culture. Having different standards for different people is an injustice, and everybody recognizes it. And as soon as they recognize it, they lose trust in us as leaders. And with a breakdown of trust, the rest of the team dynamic folds. If we lose trust, we lose care. We're certainly not satisfied. Ultimately, we stop performing. And if we're not performing as a team, what's the point? So an uneven distribution of accountability is a clear deficiency in leadership. And therefore, once again, we come back to accountability is synonymous with leadership. And then this nasty question: what is accountability? There's another thing that I ask literally everywhere I go. All right, accountability is a core value in your company. What is accountability? And a lot of times, in fact, it's certainly been more than once that a leader has told me, you know, Cujo, I don't really know, which is a fascinating response. It's also a demonstration of vulnerability, which is a necessary precondition to our definition of accountability. So that there's actually a lot of good behind that. Most of the time, leaders tie it to the fulfillment of individual responsibility. And most of the time, most of the leaders in the room are not satisfied by the degree of accountability practiced by their teammates. One of the challenges that we have is that we have an inadequate definition of what accountability is. And by not having the right definition, it makes sense that we would be unsatisfied by the degree of accountability practiced by our teammates. And so here is a definition for all of you. You got your phones out, you can snap a shot of this, you can take a note, jotting that down. Journaling is really powerful. What's accountability? We teach that it's taking absolute ownership, the outcomes that we as a team achieve. And absolute is further defined as not qualifying or diminishing in any way. It would be very disingenuous of me as your team leader on the heels of a failure to come into a room and say, look, everybody, I take absolute ownership of the fact that I did my part right. The moment that I say something poisonous like that, you know that I've just called everybody out, and I'm doing the absolute opposite of taking absolute ownership. And so what are we really getting at? What's the most important part of this definition? It's actually the second part, what we're taking accountability of, what we're taking ownership for. It's the outcomes that we as a team achieve. And this derives from a high performance team ethos that says, if one of us fails, we all do. So if you're trying to get a little bit of understanding of what makes us special in the high performance team world, we see our enterprise, what it is that we do as a team effort. And if one of us has failed, all of us have. And what you're going to find from us is that we're fighting over who is more at fault, who actually is going to take more ownership of the team failure when things don't go right. And that's a very healthy place for us to be. And what I would encourage us to do is to update how we lead our teams. I would say we do so by doing two very, very important things coming off of today's webinar. Number one, something that I don't see very much of in business. We need to ritualize accountability, which means that accountability doesn't just follow failures, which is most of the time the way that it's practiced in North American small and medium-sized business. It needs to be an all-the-time thing. We need to figure out why we won so we can celebrate it. And we've got to change our understanding of what accountability is. Can we agree that accountability is weaponized? I mean, across our societies, accountability is weaponized. We see it as something that follows a failure and leads to somebody being blamed and publicly shamed. And who wants to be part of that? I don't. If you're going to invite me to an accountability session where you're going to blame me for our failure, I'm probably not going to come. There's a reason why so few people want to be part of accountability sessions. So accountability can't just follow failure. It's got to follow the wins. It's got to be ritualized. We have to change our understanding of what it is. Here's what I see accountability as. It's a leadership function that brings people in. It drives engagement at a time when so few of our coworkers are engaged. It's a competitive advantage, specifically because accountability done correctly is where the team goes to learn. And one of the things that we started to kind of pick up at the outset of the pandemic, every one of us, was we started to become a learning organization. We had to. I mean, just remember back to those horrific days, March, April of 2020. We were worried about how to keep the doors open, how to keep the lights on. We were wondering, how are we going to sell? We were grappling with all kinds of different challenges and dynamics. And so what we ended up having to do is make decisions on a daily basis about how we were going to move forward. Some of those decisions worked. Some of those decisions didn't work. We had to learn from the ones that didn't work in order to move forward. Question is, are we still learning organizations? And if not, why not? And the opportunity before us is to change that back to what was so powerful about 2020, evolving into learning organizations. Accountability is the way that we can evolve into becoming learning organizations through a ritual that we call the debrief. What is the debrief? Another definition for you. It's the constructive, read positive, forward-focused evaluation, not of outcome quality, but rather decision and action quality. Why? Because we're all operating in an increasingly complex world, and we have to recognize the implication of complexity to how it is we practice accountability. And then the final piece is we're measuring against the objectives we set out to achieve. So one more time, what's a debrief? It's the constructive, positive, forward-focused evaluation of decision and action, not outcome quality, measured against the objectives we set out to achieve. And this ritual is something that needs to be conducted, not some of the time, but all the time. It becomes part of the team's life cycle, how a team goes about the business of teaming, accomplishing mission success and all the different missions that we are out there accomplishing. And the output of our accountability ritual ought to be a better plan to win the day the next time around. So it's actually part of our resilience strategy. It's actually part of the way that we instill hope and optimism in a better tomorrow amongst the members of our team. It's a leadership function. And it's a brilliant approach. And by the way, it works. As I was writing my first book, Debrief to Win, found two researchers who stumbled across the debrief. Their names, Tannenbaum and Sarasoli, no connection to the armed forces of the United States that I can discern. They found out about debriefs. They started running debriefs. They ran debrief after debrief after debrief. And then they reported the results of those analyses. And they said that individuals and teams that understand how to do what we're talking about today see a huge performance boost. They say it's 20 to 25%. I'll tell you, I think their numbers are low, but we'll take them. Maybe we take a second to jot down what a 20 to 25% performance boost would do for us. I think it would probably do a lot of good. I met somebody not too long ago who said after 10 years of profitability, they're having their first non-profitable year this year ever. 20 to 25% performance boost would substantially change the pain that they're in right now. So that's a very, very important point. Now, one other thing, and I'll tee it up, Ann, for us to have a conversation here in just a second, is that a lot of us as leaders looking for the quick fix, like, hey, just give me the checklist. Cujo, give me the 6-part checklist so that I can go out there and practice this thing and I'm good to go. But that's a very limited view of what it is we're talking about, because accountability isn't a checklist, it's a leadership function. And as we go about the process of understanding accountability, we have to recognize that it nests within so much more. Like, we have to understand what it is that we're accountable for. We have to create an environment where it's safe for us to be vulnerable. That's one that's rich in psychological safety, formally defined by Dr. Timothy Clark as an environment of rewarded vulnerability, something that American Air Force fighter squadrons have a lot of, it turns out. We have to know plan effectively. And that's a big issue. In fact, when it comes to planning, we're not very good at it tactically in business. And it's in planning that we set conditions for whether or not accountability can actually serve us. And then we have to understand organizational design, a little bit of military doctrine. So team accountability is one of several pillars that helps us to be able to lead effectively. And it sits within the context of other things that have to be done correctly in order for it to work for us. And I think that's probably enough for right now. Happy to stop my share and go into a conversation with you, Anne, if that would serve our community best.
I think that would be fantastic. Thank you. I was furiously typing some notes and connecting a lot of the dots that you've shared with some of the speakers that we've had come to the Vistage community. I know you mentioned psychological safety, and Amy Edmondson was one of our early speakers in the pandemic. I hadn't heard it defined as rewarded vulnerability, so I really appreciate that and wanted to delve into what, in your opinion, what does that look like for leaders? How do you model it? How do you encourage it from the top down? How is that evidenced in an organization?
Brilliant. And so, yes, Dr. Edmondson's webinar in April of 2020 was outstanding. She, I believe, introduced Vistage to VUCA, the environment within which we find ourselves, a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment. She also wrote an outstanding book called The Fearless Organization, should be part of everybody's library. Dr. Clark advances on Edmondson's work in writing The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety. And so we get into the most important aspect of culture, which is to create an environment where it's safe to be vulnerable without fear of the consequence. And why would that be at all interesting to any of us? Simply because if we're going to take ownership, that's probably the hard part of this is going to be us taking ownership of the failures. Like owning the fact that we won, easy. Every one of us is equipped to do that. But to be able to stand up as a senior executive, maybe even the CEO, founder of a company, and say the reason why this year is so painful is because of my poor leadership. Taking ownership that way demands vulnerability. And what is vulnerability? Dr. Edmondson says it's essentially the willingness and ability to admit our weaknesses and mistakes publicly. Dr. Clark says it's exposing oneself to a state of potential loss and harm. I say it's the ability to be honest when it hurts. We have to be vulnerable if we're going to be able to take ownership. So it's a necessary precondition to practicing accountability / leading appropriately. And to answer your question of what does that look like in business, it means we're modeling that behavior, not when it suits us, like not when it's easy to do, but more importantly, when we think that it's going to cost us.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So standing up in front of the board and saying, yeah, we didn't hit the mark. It's because of me. It's because of my leadership, the decisions that I made that didn't pan out. That's what it demands of us. And what we find is, and I don't know if you've ever seen the movie The Right Stuff, kind of popular back in the 80s. Is at the very beginning of it, we get to watch the story of Chuck Yeager as he breaks the speed of sound. And in the movie, they really dramatize what it was that he was going through as he's pushing through the sound barrier. And the airplane's shaking, the camera's shaking, instruments are exploding. And then, you wonder, can he make it? I mean, is this worth it? Like, this is really, really painful. Oh my gosh. And yet when he punches through, it's smooth sailing on the other side. Everything is so calm, so peaceful, so nice. And I think it's the same way when it comes to vulnerability. Many of us were raised in an environment where it was unsafe for us to be vulnerable. And so we've conditioned ourselves to never be. We're infallible, which is 100% unrealistic. But we've created this false sense of infallibility in order to protect ourselves from what we think is going to be this pain. What we find is that as we break through the sound barrier of being vulnerable and we manifest it, we up the trust that our teammates have in us and we satisfy them. They believe in us. They're confident in us because they saw our human side, and that's what they want from us.
So I asked Adam Grant and I talked about this. I'm going to ask you the same question is how do you model vulnerability without damaging your credibility? Because if
Oh,
you're too vulnerable and accept your failures and make them public, there's got to be a delicate balance there, right?
yeah. Epically brilliant question. And it comes down to there is really not that big of a balance when you really look at it. When you take this down to its tactical components, it's stunningly easy to do. But what it really demands is that we have clarity of what it was that we set out to do and how it is that we are going to try and measure ourselves. Okay, so where it becomes fuzzy is when we enter into accountability absent a standard, and that's where we're searching. And in that search, we might admit to things that we really didn't need to talk about. If we have a defined standard and we have a fact-based approach to analysis, then the relevant facts have to come to the table in order for us to get to the truth of what went down. And so it's an expectation from everybody that we're going to put what's relevant to this conversation on the table for us all to consider to help us to learn from this experience. And that's part of the methodology of a debrief. The very first step of a debrief done correctly is to gather the facts of what occurred. And that's a collaboration. So everybody's going to contribute the relevant facts. And if that's your modus operandi, understanding what it is that we're analyzing, what the standard of performance is against which we're measuring it, and then we're going to gather the facts and everybody has to contribute, it makes it easy.
Mhm.
And that's exactly how it is in a fighter squadron. We have a standard of performance that we begin each one of our debriefs with saying, what was the mission? What were the objectives? And now what were the facts? And the facts have to be on the table from everybody in order for us to get to the proximate truth of what took place. We're never going to get 100% truth, but the
Mhm.
proximate truth is going to be more than sufficient for us. And then the analysis kind of, it flows from there. It's
Okay.
stunningly easy if that's your rhythm.
Mm. So if the leader's putting their own facts on the table and that turns out to be where the breakdown was, then that's something it's kind of levels the playing field for
Absolutely.
all
I
of
mean,
yeah.
it's there for everybody to see. We've all been part of it. And so it just becomes, it takes a lot of the emotion out of it, frankly.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. Reminds me of Jocko Willink when he came and he shared his story on extreme ownership and how when you take ownership yourself, it's much easier down the line for people to say, well, actually, here was my part in it, and here was my part. And then in the end, all of the facts come out.
Well, and so let's build on that for just a second, because what I've noticed in teaching this is that many leaders are inclined to use the phraseology, I've got to hold my people to account. Like I've got to
Mm-hmm.
hold them to account, which suggests that the buck stops with them. All right. And so it's a them performance issue. My people's performance has to be held to it. I look at it differently. First of all, I never refer to my teammates as my people. Like I'm privileged to be part of a team. We're all in this thing together. I may have a role that says that I'm the formal leader, but I think of each of us when it comes to team contributions as equal. All right, so there's going to be no differentiate. Like if you and I are part of a team, but I'm the CEO, we're in a debrief. I'm held to the same standard that you are, and the moment that shifts, that's the moment that we have an unjust culture and accountability does not serve us. But the more important feature of this conversation is that if if my people aren't fulfilling their responsibilities, I have to ask myself, how am I complicit? And I would argue that most of the time that we're dissatisfied by the degree of accountability that's practiced by our teammates, we're just going to eradicate my people from the lexicon today. Most of the time, we can trace back to ourselves the root cause of why it is that performance is not up to par. And many times, dare I say, most of the time, there's a lack of clarity of expectations. So who's responsible for making sure that everybody has clear expectations on what we're going to be held to account for? That's a leadership function. We as leaders need to clarify expectations. Too often, I hear excuses like, well, my teammates should know. They should know what I'm thinking. My teammates should be able to figure out what it is that they're responsible for. And anytime you flip the script and you ask, well, would you be satisfied working in that kind of environment? The answer is heck no. And yet somehow it's okay for us, though, to do that to others. So I think it's a leadership function, and lack of clarity of expectations that we need to own.
Well, there's probably people who've built their career on being intuitive to what leaders know and enabled that behavior, right?
Yeah, I suppose not calling that out is also a problem. So we ought to
Mm.
demand clarity of expectations from
Mhm.
leaders when there's ambiguity.
Yeah, yeah.
Can I
So,
may I
yeah.
offer just a quick, because you said we could take an extra hour if we wanted to, didn't you, Ann? All right, just kidding, just kidding, Vistage community. I had the privilege of delivering a Vistage workshop one afternoon someplace in the United States. All right. And so I finished the afternoon workshop. It's a little bit more dicey proposition because you got the food coma going on. You got people that are worried about traffic. Anyway, uh, the chair at the end of the thing says, "Cujo, you gave me so much to think about. This was a really, really interesting discussion, and we've never debriefed a day before. Like, we've never debriefed a Vistage day. Could you stick around for a couple of extra minutes while we do so?" So, all right, that's fine. And so I'm collecting my things and putting my stuff away so I don't leave my power cord behind. And the chair asks the members, "Hey, so what do you think? How was today?" And to a person, they said it was an outstanding day. Like, they said, this morning's executive session was epic. We had a decent speaker. It was an outstanding day, they said. And you can see the look of satisfaction and the nods and the smiles. And the chair goes, "Well, I'm pretty sure Cujo would push us to go deeper than that. Like, I'm pretty sure Cujo would challenge us on this. This was an epic day thing. So come on, people." And what he's basically saying is that we've got to find fault with today.
Mm.
Okay.
Mhm.
All right. So somebody goes along with that and says, "Yeah, actually, now that I think about it, it would have been even cooler if we had had this. So today was good, but it could have been even better if we had this." And immediately, because I'm watching facial expressions, I see a couple of people are like, "Oh, yeah, maybe I
Mhm.
was wrong. Maybe today wasn't actually that fantastic of a day. And this is a great idea." And that's the point where I interjected. You asked me to stick around, so let me offer you my thoughts. And I said, real quick inject, when did we establish the standard of what would make today an outstanding day? Like, when did we create this notion of this would make it that much better? And to that person's credit, I heard about 15 seconds ago, Cujo. I go, "Okay, good. So if we just established the standard against which we're going to measure today after the day is formally done, what is our ability to achieve it?" We all agreed 0% chance of achieving a standard that was just created
Mm.
after the day was done. So how does that work? How satisfying is that for anybody who's associated with this thing, to set the standard of performance after the performance is done? And I wonder how often we take that approach to leadership into our projects, into our events, into our various missions. And I wonder how it is that our teammates are responding to that, knowing that the standard is going to shift. The goalposts are literally going to move after we're done.
Mm.
That clarity of expectations has to be set up front. And that's one of my rants. All right. And that's one of my
Okay.
rants.
Okay. You said you had three,
I
so
have 3 rants. Yes. That's one of my
one
rants.
done. No, I think that's a great one. But I wonder, in this concept of a debrief or a plus delta, if you take that new expectation and say, next time when we execute a similar mission, now our standards, you're always iterating and raising your standards. So would you agree that that's effective that way?
It can be, as long as we agree that the new standard is X. X is the way that we're going to measure the next iteration, not Y. So if we take this forward and we say, all right, we're going to improve, we're going to add this new feature, and then we go forth and we do this thing, and then we once again crush ourselves by saying, well, it could have been even better. At some point, you're going to lose the team. Like, this notion of perpetual improvement, but never ever achieving the desired outcome,
Hmm.
that at some point people are gonna stop trying, which actually which actually I said maybe it's a perpetuation of the previous rant. One of the things
Hmm.
that I've also noted is maybe it's an endemic in business, is saying, there's always room for improvement. There's always room for improvement. So I'm never going to give my employees the top score because there's always room to grow. So we're
Mm-hmm.
basically putting a carrot out in front of people, saying you can never achieve what it is that's out in front of you here. We're gonna try and keep you going because you can always improve and da, 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 da. But really, the way that I would summarize that approach is it's a cop out. It's an
Mm-hmm.
absolute leadership cop out. It says that I don't potentially have the guts to say that we've met the mark. I don't even know what the mark is. So I'm always going to say that things could get better. It is an absolute cop out. And I've had Vistage members pull me aside and say it's because of those kinds of features that they've mentally quit the companies that they're in. And I've actually talked to a couple of people that left because
Mm-hmm.
they go at some point, if I know that I can never achieve the mark, why would I even try?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So a much better approach when it comes to accountability and motivation is to set the standard, to agree to the standard at the outset of the year, to frequently reevaluate, like, how are we doing in terms of achieving this standard, so that we help our employees to achieve the standard, so that we can celebrate having achieved the standard. And then, and to your point, let's set a higher bar next year. Let's reward somebody by saying, you know what? You've demonstrated that you can not only meet the standard, but you probably can exceed it. So why don't we give this a shot? Why don't we set a higher bar for next year? You're capable of it. You're somebody that's special. And we recognize it. Oh, now we get that buy-in, right? That engagement.
Yeah.
We get that enthusiasm to perform, that passion to want to come back. And that's really, really important.
Mm. Fantastic. I think our members will find some great value in shifting their thinking that way. So you mentioned some chairs, and we've got some chairs on the session today who have some specific questions for you. Um, in terms of your definition of accountability, our chairs talk to members about accountability as responsibility with measurement, as well as good and bad consequences. So this chair would like to update their narrative. So updating the definition of responsibility with measurement and good and bad consequences. How would you update that narrative?
Yeah. Okay. I would revamp the entire thing to say that accountability is taking absolute ownership for the outcomes of the team achieves, period, dot. I would say that if we're going to talk about, what do you say, the good and bad result, what was the
Good and bad
good and
consequences.
bad consequences? Yeah. Then we need to make sure that everybody acknowledges that they share in those consequences. So if we as a team have failed, then all of us share in the consequence of that failure, starting with the team leader. And the team leader is the one that's ultimately going to bear the brunt of the blame for said failure, because the leader owns everything that happens on their watch. Period. Dot. In a discussion, accountability goes up the chain of command and it rests at the top. And that's one of the features of it that makes it so interesting. And by the way, when accountability rests at the top, like when I own everything that happens on my watch, which is a really difficult thing ultimately to do, it's part of the burden of leadership, heads up. I create an environment that's so different, so countercultural, that folks say, I can't believe that this is the way that we do things here. And I'm so glad that I'm here. And the way that we measure whether or not we have a really strong team is when people start to say, well, boss, I appreciate that, but I think I'm actually more to blame for this one. I own my part. And if we have conflict of the sort that says everybody's fighting over who's more at fault here, perfect, because that's ultimately what we're not looking to do, is to blame anybody, but to learn from
Mm-hmm.
this experience. And so if we have people that are enthusiastic about saying, I own, the outcome from this whole thing is, here's what I'm going to fix. Here's what I'm going to fix. Here's how I'm going to do this better next time. And that we as a team, we actually find that we build the bonds of trust in that kind of a dynamic. And what I've said for a long time is that we as a team need to rally around failure. We're not a team until we learn how to fail well together. And a demonstration of us failing well together is people fighting over who owns it.
Mm. Interesting. Well, everybody owning that piece. So I am interested in, and I think our members would be too, about the fact that it's not a private, like feedback is not a private, it's, the teams learn together. But when mistakes are really critical, if someone has made a mistake that is pretty significant, how can you, without shaming them, let them know the gravity of what's happened as part of that accountability?
Yeah. So let's break this apart into two parts. First of all, let's talk about the toxic implications of private accountability. Okay, so you and I are on a team. I have not been doing very well. Everybody knows it. You pull me as the boss aside, Anne, into your office for a private conversation about my lack of performance. Okay, so everybody sees me go into your office.
Yeah.
And then they see us come out and we're laughing, and I'm like, yeah, and you're laughing like Cujo, oh my gosh, and maybe there's a hug and off we go. And the rest of the team is wondering, like, what the heck just happened there? Like, this is the guy that's not performing, and I just saw him laughing coming out of Anne's office. Now, it could have been that we had a breakthrough moment, like we figured this thing out. I've recommitted. Now I'm going to fix whatever. But nobody else knows, and will ever actually know unless either of us breaks down and shares what took place. You're not going to, though, because as a leader, you've chosen to go private, right? So you're not going to share. I may not share, and so that actually can potentially poison the well of the team, causing us to wonder what went on. What I would offer in its place is accountability is a team sport, performance is a team issue. The debrief is a fact-based approach to learning. When we get the facts on the table, they speak for themselves. If I was supposed to have flipped the switch to keep the server on overnight, and the fact is that I didn't, I can't deny that. That's out there. And all of us know it. So why don't we just confront it? And here's the issue. It could be that my not having flipped the switch is due to my lack of understanding of how to flip the switch, about when to flip the switch, about what it takes to flip the switch properly, whatever else. And so maybe it's in that team dynamic that somebody comes back and says, Cuj, I had the same issue when I first started here. And here's what I did. I set an alarm to make sure that I remember to flip the switch at this time. I'm like, hey, that's a great idea. Could be, though, that it's a me issue, that I'm not the right person to be flipping the switch. But if we're having debrief after debrief where the facts substantiate that I'm not flipping the switch, at some point, guess who's going to self-evaluate and go, I don't really probably belong in this position because it seems like I can't flip the switch very much. And I feel so bad for being always the person that has let the team down. I mean, it makes the HR conversation go a lot easier when somebody self-eliminates. And we see that in our fighter squadron debriefs. When people consistently can't get the job done, they also understand that maybe I'm in the wrong job.
So it accelerates the exit of people who are not performing or not a fit.
Absolutely. It's a fact-based approach to learning. It really helps that we're centered on facts.
All right, I have time for a few more questions. And I could talk for hours because I had many of my own, but we have a lot of comments and questions from our audience as well. What I did think this was interesting too. So you said focus on tactics, not outcomes. And I think Adam Grant said the same thing, that we want to reward the process and not just the outcome, because you could have a terrible process that, luck would have it, there's a good outcome. So talk a little bit more about how do you get past starting with outcomes and focus on the tactics or the process?
Yeah. Okay. So this is actually a very deep conversation. We're just going to hit the 30,000 foot part. It ties to the fact that we're operating, as Dr. Edmondson advised us all, in a VUCA environment. So VUCA, it's a U.S. Army War College term, stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Complexity is something that we need to understand because it changes the way that we approach accountability. And most of us have not been formally trained on how to practice accountability. Most of us apply an outcome-oriented view to accountability that was instilled in us by our parents, by our coaches growing up. And so it seemed like it worked, and so we brought it into the business world. And in that world, it says, hey, if I flip the light switch on and the lights don't come on, then we need to fix it. So like, we had to fix this system because the system is broken. The problem with complexity is that it doesn't work that way. When we're in a complex system, we can make great decisions and still lose. We can also make horrible decisions and still win. And so if you acknowledge the complexity that you're operating in, you have to shift how it is that you practice accountability. And you can only be accountable for what it is that you can control. So I can't be accountable for whether or not I'm lucky, but I can be accountable for whether or not I made the right decisions and took the appropriate action. So if we have a standard of performance that I violated, like I did not do things the way that we're supposed to, well, then that's something that we can talk about. But if I did everything right in accordance with our made the right decisions, took the appropriate actions, and we still lost, well, then that's something that we can talk about. But if I did everything right in accordance with our made the right decisions, took the appropriate actions, and we still lost, I would argue that the feedback that I should get is, Cujo, you did everything that you could control right. We got pretty unlucky today. That's going to happen. Keep up the great work, brother. And I want you to do the same thing again tomorrow. That's a different conversation than what we're used to. We're chasing after outcomes always, KPIs and metrics, KPIs and metrics, KPIs and metrics. I'm telling you, in order to be human team leaders in a complex environment, we have to concentrate on decision and action quality. And there's my 3-hour conversation boiled down into a minute and a half.
Excellent. Very good. And okay, so a couple more questions. So Alan Hauge from St. Louis, who I believe you brought come to his groups, he asks, what new and special challenges does the war for talent and the seller's market for labor imply for how we hold people accountable? So what new challenges are there, if any, holding Gen V versus the boomers accountable, and Gen X, right? Just,
yeah, look,
let's not leave us out.
Here's what I would here's my macro answer, Alan, and I'm a huge champion of you. Okay, you're an awesome guy. So glad that you're here today. You honor us by being here. Everybody across all generations seeks adequate leadership. I mean, we'd really prefer good leadership, and everybody across all generations wants to be held accountable. And many of you are out there scoffing me right now, like, oh, Cujo, and that's not true. No. At our core, we want it. We know that it's good. Everybody, every age group, generation wants it when it's practiced the right way. And the biggest implication to us as leaders right now is that fear of how it is that our teammates are going to respond to our inadequate process of accountability is causing us to increasingly not practice it, and also to tolerate specifically poor behaviors. And so fear is not the motivation into good leadership. In fact, it's the exact opposite. We can't be in fear of, and we have to realize this. So Alan, if you and I are on a team and we've got a toxic member of the team, says horrible things, does horrible things, not living in accordance with our core values, but is a performer, and I, as the team leader, allow that to linger, like, and when you pull me aside, Alan, you're like, this can't happen anymore. Like, I can't believe that this guy's still on the team. And I'm like, let it be, Alan, because he's still pumping that output. What I'm basically telling you is that I've got a separate standard for this person. And what you're seeing from me is that I'm not leading adequately, and you're going to choose to walk. So I'm going to lose you because you have higher standards than this. And by the way, you've got other opportunities out there. So that's the problem with poor behaviors. And if we don't practice meaningful and effective, positive, forward-focused accountability, ultimately everybody throttles back on their performance. And so many leaders have confessed to me as the accountability guy that they've throttled back on accountability out of fear of losing somebody. They tell me, Cujo, I can't practice accountability because if I hold somebody to account, then they're going to walk. I'm telling you, you're not practicing accountability the right way if practicing accountability is going to cause somebody to walk. If you're doing it the right way, it brings people in, right? Mm-hmm. And the second thing is you're losing performance from your top performers. You're basically sending a strategic message that says, around here, we're aiming for average or below average performance. And who wants to be part of that kind of a team?
Right. And those top performers could be impacted by subpar performance, and, that leads to them leaving as well. So the trickle 100%. Down effect. Yeah. I did have a generational question as well. And so just to stay with that for a minute, you talked about victim mentality, that's a lot of what we're dealing with in organizations. And I was curious, where does that come from? Could that be generational? Could that be modeled as part of the culture when you have an excess of victim mentality?
Yeah. I have to be careful how I answer this question because it's a really, really deep one, and it ties into all kinds of toxic elements right now. But probably the easiest way to summarize my answer is, if we're allowing it to linger, then it's a leadership issue. Okay, so regardless of where it is that its origin story ultimately is, if we're allowing that to be here, to fester, then we're not leading adequately enough. It ought to be a non-negotiable to not tolerate victimhood. And so that's that's the challenge for us, is to be willing to draw the line and say that this doesn't work here, to talk about it on a regular basis, to say that we don't tolerate defensiveness, excuses, justifications, counter accusations, and finger pointing, and to have the courage to say, I would rather that you walk, if that's your natural inclination, than to keep that here. And again, many of you are going to say, well, I can't afford to do that, Cujo. But you also have to say, at the same time, have to reference your notes about what it's costing you to allow the victim mentality to be here. And then you can do your cost benefit. You'll find that victim mentality, that's a poison.
Hmm. Right. Well, especially if the victim mentality is an opposite part of one of your core values, right? So that's an anti value.
Yes.
Yeah. We talk a lot about, the culture is translation of the values to behaviors. And so that feels like, once you translate the values to behaviors, that's one key for accountability. We're holding you accountable for these behaviors that mirror these values. I was wondering, is there a different flavor of accountability for living the values and contributing to the culture versus the accountability to like the process or tactics or completing tasks? Are those two different levels of accountability?
They're all baked into one. And the easy way to summarize this is, if we win, like, so we hit mission outcomes, we've achieved our objectives, we won the deal, but we did so unethically, then we
Mm-hmm.
lost. So
Mm-hmm.
how it is that we're achieving success is arguably even more important than whether or not we achieve it. So that's a really, really important point. So having standards, if you remember back to the accelerator framework that I showed, understanding what our missions are and understanding what our standards are, and having standards not only for the tactics that we employ to accomplish mission success, but also for our behavioral norms, that's really, really important. And they all tie together.
Yeah. Yeah.
A great illustration of this, Ritz-Carlton and Chick-fil-A. Like, behavioral norms matter there and actually have a huge impact on the customer experience, allowing those companies to thrive. And if the behavioral norms weren't the way that they were, then it would be a totally different experience and the outcomes wouldn't be correct. And so it's important that the two are tied together always.
Very true. You gave us, last question, a lot of books that you've referenced, and one of the questions that came in is the book that you referenced on Blindside. What was that book?
Blind Spot, John Clifton, CEO of Gallup. Outstanding book. If you're flying someplace, you'll read it on the flight.
Okay. You mentioned a couple other books. Do you want to just I don't know if you remember all the ones that you mentioned, but
we started by talking about Dr. Amy Edmondson. Her outstanding book, The Fearless Organization, is a must read for every leader. You add to that Dr. Timothy Clark's The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety. Now you're on to what it is that underpins creating a learning environment, having the culture within which accountability will thrive. You have to have an environment of rewarded vulnerability for people to be willing to be vulnerable.
Okay. So adding to our reading list, and we should all watch The Right Stuff, apparently, just to revisit that. And yes. I understand you also recommend that everyone watches Top Gun Maverick. Is that correct?
I do. Can I say, I mean, this is just between us friends, that even though it's a movie about the B team, it's outstanding. All right. And it moves me to tears. And there are so many great leadership takeaways. We could do a webinar just on the leadership takeaways from Top Gun Maverick. Maybe we'll do that someday. Okay.
Yeah, I would love that. I would love that. So thank you so much for your insights and distilling them down to the 30,000-foot view. Still some great takeaways. So you gave us a lot of new ways to think about accountability. So thank you so much for being here.
My sincere pleasure. And here's to you for being here today. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Vistage, for the opportunity to contribute.
Thank you. Yes. And to continue your learning and to go back and refresh, we'll be sending a link to the recording and the slides within 24 hours. And as I mentioned, this is part of a series, so please be sure to join us for some of our upcoming webinars that are available. On Friday, September 22nd, we have a session on future-proofing your talent. What matters to tomorrow's workforce matters to today. So talking about hiring and some of the challenges in workforce, that will be some key insights from our partner Insperity. And on September 29th, I'm excited that we're welcoming 3 Vistage members to our Artificial Intelligence Roundtable. We're going to learn some best practices from them as early adopters and some of the results that they've seen from their leveraging of artificial intelligence. So you can register for those sessions now at vistage.com/webinar. That's vistage.com/webinar. And for our Vistage members who did not see it yet, please don't miss the member exclusive conversation with Adam Grant, who also speaks about vulnerability. That's available to watch through November 25th. So thank you everyone so much for your time today. Be safe and be well.